9 people are killed in Germany in the latest racially motivated attack. The Interior Minister is urging a fight against what he calls the poison of extremism. So how will the government tackle this growing problem? This is Inside Story. Hello there and welcome to the programme. I'm Nastasya Tay. Germany's leaders are promising a strong response to these latest racially motivated attacks. A gunman killed 9 people at 2 shisha cafes on Wednesday night in the city of Hanau, and he chose places that are popular with Turkish and Kurdish communities. The 43-year-old suspect, who was later found dead with his mother, had posted documents with racist and far-right views online. Politicians are calling this a terrorist attack. Now, more police are being sent to protect mosques and synagogues, as well as airports and train stations. The Interior Minister says such attacks are a reminder of what he calls the growing threat of extremism in Germany.
I want to say and repeat clearly once again, far-right extremism, anti-Semitism and racism are poisons that confuse people's minds and causes evil to emerge. That's what we need to acknowledge after the far-right actions in Hanau. Therefore, we must oppose racism. Society and politicians must work shoulder to shoulder to combat the consequences.
Now, the German government says there were more than 8,500 attacks by far-right supporters in the first half of last year. That's an increase of almost 1,000 on the year before. In 2018, 5 states reported at least 3 right-wing racist and anti-Jewish attacks a day. One such attack on a synagogue in Halle last year left 2 dead. And last June, a pro-migrant politician was shot dead outside his home. The government says it's stepping up efforts to tackle the problem. Last week, they arrested 12 men for planning attacks. One was a police officer. But it's a problem that Germany's been struggling to contain for decades. From 2000 until 2007, a neo-Nazi group murdered 10 people, mostly immigrants. At the time, police denied the attacks were racially motivated. Well, now let's bring in our guests. In Riedstadt, that's near Frankfurt, we have Abda-ssamad Yazidi. He's the Secretary-General of the Central Council of Muslims in Germany. In Berlin, we have Hans-Jakob Schindler. He's Senior Director of the Counter-Extremism Project. And in Oslo, Eviane Leidig from the Centre for Research on Extremism at the University of Oslo. Thanks for joining us and welcome to the programme. Mr. Yazidi, I do want to start with you because you've been involved with the Muslim community in Germany. And Hanau, by my understanding, is a working-class community, but it's been ethnically diverse for decades, long before immigration became such a divisive issue in German politics. So a lot of its residents, even the ones from Turkish or Kurdish backgrounds, were born in Germany. So did this come as a surprise?
Yes. These attacks are not a big surprise for us because, unfortunately, the hate speech against Muslims, against people who looks like migrants or has rising and has going bigger and bigger, and we always have been saying that what happened in Christchurch, for example, can also happen here in Germany, and the government and the authorities did not take this thing were very serious, and now we find out that the far-right extremists in Germany began to change their strategy from just speaking, just giving hate speech, to acting against Muslims and killing people. We had a lot of attacks in Germany, attacks against mosques, against women wearing hijab in the streets, and it was alarmizing. It was very horrible, and we did not see that there have been the authorities, the security organizations did not take this thing very seriously.
Well, you raise an issue there around hate speech, and I see that this phrase Kurdish terror, has been cropping up around the place. How widespread, Dr. Schindler, is its use in German politics and mainstream media there?
Well, look, I mean, we obviously do have a massive right-wing problem at the moment, but terrorism, like as happened 2 days ago, doesn't grow in isolation. It needs a permissive environment, and unfortunately, what my organization has been documented for many years is that there is a very permissive environment in cyberspace and on the internet. Frankly, yesterday, when we were looking at the attacks in Hanau, within minutes, we had access to all the material that this individual has posted online. This is good for our analysis of the event, but frankly, it shouldn't be that easy. So there is a work here cut out for the government as well as the industry. Platform providers should not shy away from their responsibility that they have in distributing this material. It cannot just be left up to the security forces or government regulation. They need to do more as well.
Sure. I'm looking at some figures here, and I see roughly a quarter of Germany's population are immigrants or their descendants. Eviane, I'm going to come to you to ask you how Europe is reflecting on these latest attacks, and not only the attacks themselves, but also the response from German politicians and the media.
Right. So my colleagues at the Center for Research on Extremism have been documenting the rise of far-right terrorism and violence across Europe. And since the 1990s, we actually see that figures have remained generally stable. However, Germany has always been an exception in terms of the number of far-right terrorist attacks and its history, of course, in dealing with neo-Nazism. But we saw a significant increase after 2015 with the refugee crisis, and most notably since 2018, where we saw the nature of far-right terrorist attacks change. So they used to be more of a small scale, but now we see a significant increase in the number of mass casualties. And of course, as Dr. Schindler has rightly pointed out, this isn't just confined to national cases, but it's a phenomenon that we see around the world, from New Zealand to the US to Europe.
Well, I do want to take a look at the broader tone of the conversation here. Well, particularly, let's use this example in Germany. This was an attack on a shisha bar, and I guess if you want to think about it stereotypically, that's potentially where you'd go to try to find people of Middle Eastern origin. And I want to take a look at this particular picture here. Let's bring it up. It's from a colouring book that was distributed just this week by a regional branch of the far-right AfD party in Germany. And if you take a closer look, you'll see it's the Muslim crescent moon and star, and it's surrounded by men with guns. Mr. El-Yazidi, how representative is this of the way that people speak about race and Islam in Germany?
Yesterday, we have been in Hanau. Our chairman, Mr. Maziak, has been in the plane from Berlin to Hanau together with our president Steinmeier, and they have been in Hanau. They visited the victims. They have been also in the marketplace, in the big place. There have been a demonstration, and what we saw that nobody of the politicians has used speaking about Islamophobia or about anti-Islamic attacks. They all have been speaking about racism, but no one wanted to use the word anti-Islamic attacks. We don't know why, because this people, how we can see in the manifestation of them, they are fighting at first against Muslims in Germany and in Europe and all in the world, and still in the government side and also in some kind of media don't want to speak seriously about the main problem. The main problem is anti-Islamic hate speech and Islamophobia in Germany, and this is what is making us. We don't know how to deal with this thing, because still when we don't use the right words, we cannot change the situation in where we are in Germany.
Well, let's talk a little more then about the government response. I see that the Interior Ministry said that in 2018, xenophobic and anti-Semitic criminal acts in Germany increased by nearly a fifth. So not just anti-Islamic, but broadly xenophobic. And nearly 90% were carried out by the far right. And even more worrying, I see the same year, police seized more than 1,000 weapons, 61% increase from the previous year. So we've been hearing these warnings of a massive rearmament of neo-Nazi groups. Dr. Schindler, is that happening?
Well, yes, but first of all, let me make one additional point. It really is important to look at the discourse here, right? The attack in Hanau, the victims, if you look at the biographies, they were not foreigners. They were Germans as much as it can be Germans. Their families came to Germany 2, sometimes 3 generations ago. So this was an attack on German society, xenophobically motivated by this very disturbed individual. But these are Germans. These are not migrants. There was no refugee crisis. There was a civil war in Afghanistan. There was a civil war in Syria that forced people to flee. So it's really important to highlight the humanity of those individuals who came to Germany. And talking about a refugee crisis, unfortunately, feeds into this kind of rhetoric from the far right.
Sure, and I will come to that shortly in terms of refugee policies. But Eviane, I do want to discuss with you how this is being policed and get your take on that. Because it does seem that not only in Germany but elsewhere, that previously resources were, I guess, disproportionately focused on Islamic extremism. And now, since Christchurch, since the Finsbury Mosque attacks, Charlottesville, we're seeing the rise of the far right here. And I see that German authorities announced not long ago that they would increase the number of agents dealing with the far right by 50%. And then there's now these draft measures to prevent online hate speech. Is all of that enough, Eviane?
Well, there certainly has been a double standard when it comes to government responses towards Islamist terrorism, as you had mentioned, and the growing threat of far-right terrorism. Certainly, governments have taken steps towards in working with tech companies and working with civil society organizations in order to address the growing rise of far-right terrorism. Most recently, in 2018, the German government did establish regulations to counter and regulate hateful and extreme speech online. And this is a particular space which has been a hub for radicalization of far-right terrorist ideas and agendas. So while the German authorities have certainly taken preventative measures in order to counter the threat of far-right terrorism, there does need to be more community-based initiatives with civil society organizations, as well as regulatory frameworks established with tech companies to help challenge the threat of the far right.
Sure. Okay, at this point, I want to take a bit of a step back here and reflect more broadly on the rise of the far right, both in Germany and beyond. Now, while the right wing has always had a strong presence in Germany for decades, it's seen a surge of support since the 2015 refugee crisis. In that year alone, nearly 1 million migrants and refugees sought asylum after Angela Merkel chose to accept them. And many of those people, as we've been talking about, were fleeing war in Syria and elsewhere, as well as poverty in Africa, the Middle East and Asia. But right-wing political parties seized on the backlash that followed. Support for the far-right AfD surged in the 2017 election, and it's now the largest opposition party in parliament. So, Mr. El-Yazidi, do you think that 2015 was the real watershed moment then for Germany in terms of turning the tide here?
I think that 2015 was a vehicle for this far right politicians to get fear and to spread fear in our society, in our community in Germany. Like my colleague in Berlin already said, these people which had been attacked in Hanau, they are Germans. They have been born here in Germany. They speak German better than the languages of their parents. And still, these far-right parties and these far-right groups and these terrorists don't want to accept them as German citizens. So, yes, 2015 was a vehicle for this people, but the people which came from all over the world, they in the main courses they didn't occur any problems for us. A lot of them, the most of them, are very integrated and are very happy to be here in Germany, and they love Germany and want to be accepted here. But the far-right ideology used this thing to spread some kind of fear in the community, and they won a lot because of that.
Well, let's talk a little bit more then about the German political climate domestically. So, Dr. Schindler, it does feel like there was another watershed moment, earlier this month in Thuringia, when we saw the AfD joining with the ruling parties in order to get a regional governor elected. And I mean, it caused a national uproar for obvious reasons. After World War II, there was a taboo against involving the far right seemingly in mainstream politics. Has that taboo now been entirely shattered? Does that open the pathway for more involvement by the far right?
No, I still hold out the hope. I mean, if you saw the reaction to the events in Thuringia, if you saw the reaction yesterday to the events in Hanau, you do see that the majority of society is nowhere near holding these kind of really strange, xenophobic, and frankly, harmful views. What happened in the last couple of years, and I don't think that 2015 is by itself the real watershed moment, is the combination of 2008 and the financial crisis and actual economic fears within Germany in combination with what happened in 2015 that allowed populist politicians who ruthlessly exploit fear and division to really rise to political influence. But I don't think this is an irreversible situation in Germany. And frankly, this is not just a situation in Germany. If you look around Europe, you do see that populist politicians all over Europe gained traction in the last couple of years. But none of this is irreversible if the majority and the middle of the political spectrum clearly stands up and says, this is not the society we can live in. This is not compatible with Article 1 of our Constitution, which says that die Würde des Menschen ist unantastbar. The honor and the integrity of a human being cannot be touched. This is what needs to be strengthened in the discourse, both in the media as well as in the political discourse, to demonstrate that these individuals do not actually present German society. Unfortunately, what happened in parallel to all of this is that the extreme right got very much more professional in the way they present their views. It was easier in the 1990s where they had a very crude, a very violent rhetoric. Now you have concepts like the Great Replacement, remigration, all terminology which really, frankly, is a cover for very extreme racist views, but sounds very much more agreeable than the old neo-Nazis in Germany and their rhetoric.
Sure, I want to throw this to Eviane. Are we seeing a seismic shift here in German politics? And I ask because there was always going to be political turbulence when Angela Merkel departed. And now we've seen Annegret Kramp-Karrenbauer, she's resigned. And now the front runner, I believe, is Friedrich Merz. And he's already been critical of Merkel's refugee policy and has already spoken out about potentially wanting to court the far-right vote. Is this the end of the German centre?
Well, I think this is a phenomenon that's reflective of political spaces in Europe more broadly. We see the mainstreaming of far-right ideas from the extreme towards these radical right parties like AfD enter into coalitions. And we see the far-right then take ownership over issues like immigration. So certainly the discourse around immigration has shifted significantly since we've seen the far right in power. There's also an issue here of looking at national representation of far right political parties versus looking at local representation of far right political parties. And too often we focus at the national level, but it's really at the local level where we see the most significant effects of far-right legislation when in government, and also the turn toward legitimacy of these far-right political parties. So then at some point down the line, they can contest at the national election stage.
Well, I want to ask you more about that because we've seen in certain countries like France, Denmark, Sweden, they've tried to curb the rise of the far right somewhat by basically taking on some of their policies and bringing them closer to the centre. And that's all about trying to attract voters back from the fringes. But has that worked, Eviane?
I mean, that's still up for debate. Obviously, it's an issue as to whether or not having these far-right political parties in government is truly representative or truly democratic in allowing those at the fringe to have a voice in the mainstream arena. But we do need to shift the conversation then towards focusing on the human equality and dignity of those who are victimized by such rhetoric and such policies.
Dr. Schindler, I want to ask you about identity, because so much of this seems to be a question around German identity. And obviously there was a big split between East and West Germany for some time, and both sides had very different post-war experiences. Are we seeing the rise of the far right more pronounced in East Germany, for instance, do you think, because of a level of disenfranchisement there?
Well, first of all, let me correct one of the myths here. The rise of the far right is not an exclusive East German or primarily East German problem. Obviously, you've seen the AfD gaining seats in some of the East German parliaments. But if you look at voting patterns, and there's a very interesting study that was published last year from the Technical University in Munich looking at voting at 1928, 30, 32, and 2017. And you could see that especially in rural areas, there is a continuation of right-wing voting patterns throughout all of these elections. So this is not a particular East German problem. And let me remind you, Hanau is not in East Germany. In Kassel, same state in Germany, Hesse, when the politician Lübke was murdered summer last year, that also is not in East Germany. So it is a fairly equally distributed German problem. Certainly the challenges in East Germany are different than they are in West Germany, because there you have biographies of the population that had a massive rupture with German unification and the near complete breakdown of the economy in East Germany. So you have families who have had seen their entire livelihoods disappear overnight within 6 months. And this kind of economic fear is easier to stoke maybe in East Germany than in West Germany. But xenophobic, racist, right-wing views are unfortunately fairly well distributed all over Germany.
Well, let me give Mr. El-Yazidi the last say here, because I do want to ask you, sir, about your perceptions of where Germany is going. As a member of the Muslim community, do you feel optimistic about the trajectory of Germany and what's being done by authorities to take the country forward as a unified body?
Germany, since decades, was known as a tolerant state, as a state where the living together between different communities and different religions was possible and was well done also. But in the last years and the last months, we saw that the far right ideology could get a little bit brighter in the society. But I am still hopeful that the middle of the German community will stay together, and this act could be also a chance for us to show the world and to show ourselves that we are more, that we are against this kind of ideologies, and that we will not let this minority change the mind of our country and the mind of our community in Germany. So I'm optimistic. And when the politicians and also the media will change their strategy and show the positive sides of Germans which have migrant parents or are coming from outside of Germany, when they begin to show the positive sides, and there are so a lot, then we will be able to change this direction where it seems that we are going now.
So even after all this violence, an opportunity here potentially to change course. I'd like to thank you all for a really interesting discussion today. Thank you to all of our guests. That's Abda-ssamad El-Yazidi, Hans-Jakob Schindler and Eviane Leidig. And thank you too for watching. You can see this program again anytime by visiting our website, that's aljazeera.com. And for further discussion, do go to our Facebook page. That's facebook.com/AJ Inside Story. And you can also join the conversation on Twitter. Our handle is @AJ Inside Story. From me, Nastasya Tay, and the entire team here in Doha, bye for now.